Decades after abandoning his son, millionaire John faces a brutal choice: beg for forgiveness or face the devastating consequences of his dark past. When a shocking truth is revealed during a tense conversation, everything changes. Will the betrayed son save the father who discarded him? Get ready for a story full of secrets and twists that will leave you breathless. John Richards had always believed that power was his greatest weapon. At 40, he had built a fortune with his vast business empire, controlling industries and the people around him. He was married to Martha, a refined woman from old money, and together they represented the pinnacle of Miami's elite. Their 2 teenage children, Eric and Sophie, were the pride of their family. Their future set to inherit the sprawling business empire John had created from the ground up. However, behind the polished image of the perfect family, a darker truth lingered. Grace, their 22-year-old housekeeper, had been a quiet presence in the Richards household for just over a year. Young, naive, and with dreams far beyond the modest life she led, Grace was kind-hearted and hardworking, always doing her best to ensure the house was in order. She had come from a small town, hoping to find a better future in the big city, but quickly realized that opportunities for someone like her, poor, young, and black, were limited. Still, she found comfort in the stability of her work and the respect she felt from the family. John, however, began to notice Grace more than he should. At first, it was just an innocent curiosity. She was unlike anyone else in his social circle, humble, genuine, and untouched by the cynical world of wealth and power in which he lived. But as the months went on, John's interest in Grace grew. He admired her youth, her beauty, and above all, her innocence. And in that innocence, he saw an opportunity. It was one night, after another argument with Martha about the pressures of his business, that John found himself in the kitchen with Grace. She was finishing the dishes, unaware that John was watching her. He struck up a conversation, complimenting her on her work. But as the conversation continued, it became more personal. John, ever the charmer, started to ask her about her dreams, her ambitions, and the life she wished she could lead. Grace, flattered by the attention of a man as powerful as John, began to open up. She told him of her dreams to leave her job one day, to build a life for herself outside of working for others. She spoke of her desire to find love, to have a family, to one day be with someone who could provide her with security and happiness. And that's when John made his move. He spoke softly, weaving a web of promises, telling Grace that she deserved more than just being a housekeeper. He told her that she was special, that he saw in her a woman who deserved to be loved and cherished. And John, with his smooth words and practiced charm, convinced Grace that he could be that person, that he could offer her the life she dreamed of. Grace, young and inexperienced, was swept up in John's words. She had never had a man like him show her attention before, let alone make such bold promises. John told her that he was trapped in a loveless marriage, that he longed for something more, someone who truly understood him. He assured her that, despite his current life, he would find a way to be with her. He told her that he cared for her deeply, that what they had could be real if she just trusted him. Blinded by his charm and the possibility of a future she had always wanted, Grace believed him. She believed that John, this powerful, wealthy man, saw something special in her, something worth risking everything for. She allowed herself to fall into his arms, convinced that this was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. But for John, it was nothing more than a passing fancy. He had no real intention of leaving Martha or changing his life. His promises were empty, his declarations of love insincere. He had gotten what he wanted, and once that moment passed, he went back to his life as though nothing had happened. Grace, however, would soon discover that her life had changed forever. Weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. Terrified, but still clinging to the hope that John meant what he had said, she decided to tell him the news, believing that he would stand by her. When she confronted John with the truth, his reaction was far from what she expected. The calm, loving man she thought she knew quickly vanished. John was cold, calculating, and distant. He listened to her in silence, and when she finished, he didn't offer words of support or love, only fear and denial. He couldn't let this pregnancy ruin his carefully constructed life, his business, his marriage, his reputation. Everything was at stake. He couldn't afford the scandal, and he had no intention of allowing this baby to be born. John quickly shut down Grace's hopes, telling her that they needed to fix this. He offered her money to get an abortion, promising to cover all the expenses and ensure her future would be taken care of, as long as she didn't keep the baby. But Grace, though devastated, refused. She couldn't bring herself to go through with it, and despite her fear of what might come, she was determined to keep her child. John's frustration turned to desperation. If Grace wouldn't go along with his plan, he needed to get rid of her another way. And that's when he devised his cruelest act yet, the false accusation. John planted some of Martha's expensive jewelry in Grace's room and fabricated a story, telling Martha that Grace had stolen from them. With manufactured evidence and a believable lie, he made Grace appear guilty of theft. Martha, heartbroken and angry, immediately demanded that Grace leave. John played his part perfectly, acting as if he too was disappointed in Grace's betrayal. But behind closed doors, John delivered a final cold message to Grace. Leave quietly, or the consequences would be worse than she could imagine. He made it clear that she had no choice. Defeated and heartbroken, Grace packed her things and left the mansion, carrying with her the unborn child and the shattered pieces of her trust in John. Grace left John's mansion that night, her heart shattered, her trust betrayed, and her future uncertain. She had no plan, no place to go, and no idea how she would raise a child alone. The man she had believed in, the man who had promised her a better life, had turned his back on her the moment things became difficult. As she walked away from the only home she had known for the past year, her tears blurred her vision. But she knew one thing for sure: she would never return. Grace moved to a neighboring town, far enough to escape the whispers and gossip, but close enough to keep her dreams alive. She found a small apartment, barely enough to fit her needs, and took on odd jobs to survive. She worked as a cleaner, a waitress, anything that would help her make ends meet. It wasn't easy, but Grace was determined. She refused to let John's betrayal define her, and above all, she refused to give up on the baby growing inside her. The months passed, and with them, Grace's strength grew. She knew that her life would never be the same, but in the midst of her struggles, she found hope. When her son Michael was born, he became her world. Grace poured every ounce of love and care into raising him, determined to give him the life he deserved, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams. Meanwhile, John continued to live his life as though nothing had happened. The scandal he had feared never materialized, and his empire grew even larger. His businesses expanded across the country, bringing him more wealth and influence than he had ever imagined. From the outside, his life was perfect. A thriving career, a beautiful family, and the respect of everyone around him. But inside, John was haunted by the choices he had made. Every so often, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, John's thoughts would drift back to Grace. He wondered what had happened to her, whether she had the baby, and if so, what kind of life they were living. But he pushed those thoughts away as quickly as they came, burying them beneath layers of work and success. There was no room for regret in John's world. He had done what he needed to do to protect his family, his business, his reputation, or so he told himself. Yet as the years passed, cracks began to form in the foundation of John's perfect life. His marriage to Martha, once a symbol of stability and wealth, began to crumble. Martha had never fully recovered from the betrayal she believed Grace had committed, and over time her resentment grew. Though John had maintained the lie for years, Martha's trust in him had eroded. They rarely spoke anymore, and when they did, it was often about practical matters. The children, the business, the household. The love that had once brought them together had long since disappeared, replaced by an icy distance that neither of them knew how to bridge. John's relationship with his children also began to fray. Eric, his eldest son, was expected to take over the family business. But as the years went by, it became clear that Eric had little interest in following in his father's footsteps. He was more interested in living a life of excess, partying, spending lavishly, and indulging in the privileges that came with being the son of a wealthy man. Sophie, on the other hand, had distanced herself from the family altogether, choosing a quiet life as an artist, far from the pressure of the business world. Both children resented the lack of emotional connection with their father, who had always been too focused on his work to truly engage with them. As John's family life crumbled, so too did his health. In his early 70s, he was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of blood cancer. The doctors told him that his only hope for survival was a bone marrow transplant, but finding a compatible donor would be difficult. His children were tested, but neither Eric nor Sophie were a match. The news hit John hard. For the first time in his life, he faced a problem that his wealth and power couldn't solve. Desperate, John began searching for a donor. He hired private investigators, scoured donor registries, and spared no expense in his quest to find someone who could save his life. But after months of searching, the results were always the same. No match. Just when hope seemed lost, John's private investigator returned with news. There was a potential match, a man living in a neighboring town. John's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and fear. The investigator handed him a file, and as John opened it, his blood ran cold. The name of the potential donor was Michael Johnson, his mother's name, Grace Johnson. John stared at the file in disbelief. Grace had kept the baby, his son. The boy he had tried to erase from his life was now a grown man. And not just any man, but the only person who could save him. The irony was unbearable. The life John had discarded, the child he had refused to acknowledge, was now his only hope. John felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Guilt, shame, fear. How could he ask for Michael's help after what he had done? How could he face Grace again after all the pain he had caused? He had spent 30 years pretending they didn't exist, and now they were the key to his survival. There was no escaping the past now. John knew what he had to do. He had to face Michael and Grace. He had to tell them the truth. But would they even listen? Would Michael, knowing the truth, be willing to save the man who had abandoned him before he was even born? John knew the odds were slim, but he had no choice. His life depended on it. With a heavy heart, John instructed his private investigator to arrange a meeting with Michael. The investigator was cautious, suggesting discretion. Michael had no idea who John was, no knowledge of his father's identity. The meeting would have to be handled carefully, but John knew there was no avoiding the truth any longer. If you've been captivated by John's journey so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The next chapter, where John confronts his long-lost son, is coming soon. Be sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss the emotional twists and turns ahead. The drive to the hospital where Michael worked was one of the longest of John's life. Each mile felt like an eternity as he grappled with the weight of what was about to happen. The man he was about to meet wasn't just a potential donor who could save his life. He was his son, the son he had abandoned, the child whose existence he had denied for so many years. John's hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel, and his heart raced with a mixture of fear and guilt. What would he say? How would Michael react? Would he even listen? Or would he walk away the moment he learned the truth? John had been a master of controlling people, of bending situations to his will, but now all control was gone. He was at the mercy of the son he had never known, and that thought terrified him more than anything. When John arrived at the hospital, he sat in the parking lot for several minutes, gathering the courage to face what was ahead. The private investigator had arranged a discreet meeting in one of the hospital's private conference rooms, under the pretense that John was a former acquaintance of Michael's mother, Grace, and needed to discuss something important with him. Michael, unaware of the true nature of the meeting, had agreed to the request out of curiosity. John took a deep breath and finally stepped out of the car, his legs feeling weak beneath him. As he walked through the hospital's sterile halls, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't just here to ask for help. He was here to confront the consequences of his actions, to face the truth he had run from for decades. When John entered the conference room, he found himself alone, with nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He took a seat at the small table, his hands resting on the polished surface, and waited. Every second felt like a lifetime, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to happen. The door opened, and Michael stepped in. John's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he was speechless, staring at the man standing before him. Michael was tall, with a strong athletic build. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his piercing eyes, the same eyes Grace had once looked at John with so much hope, scanned the room with curiosity. There was something about his demeanor, the way he carried himself, that reminded John of Grace's quiet strength. But there was also something else, something unmistakably familiar, something that belonged to John. Michael offered a polite nod, his expression neutral but cautious. He clearly had no idea who John really was. "Mr. Richards?" Michael asked as he sat down across from him. John nodded, his throat tight. For a moment he struggled to find his voice. How could he possibly begin this conversation? How could he look into the eyes of his own son, a son he had abandoned, and ask for help? "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me," John finally said, his voice strained. "I know this must be unexpected." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression still guarded. "It is. My mother hasn't spoken much about her past, especially when it comes to people she used to know. So when I got the request to meet, I was curious. What exactly is this about?" John's heart pounded. He could feel the weight of every word that was about to come out of his mouth. This was it, the moment of truth. "It's about your mother," John began slowly, his voice faltering. "And about you?" Michael's brow furrowed, his curiosity deepening. "What do you mean?" John hesitated, feeling the enormity of the situation press down on him. "Your mother and I, we knew each other a long time ago. When she worked for me, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've kept hidden for a very long time." Michael sat up straighter, his expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion. "You knew my mother?" he asked, his voice tinged with a note of skepticism. "Yes," John replied quietly, "I did. She worked for me many years ago. But that's not all." He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the words that would change everything. "Michael, I'm your father." The room fell into a heavy silence. For a moment, Michael simply stared at John, his expression frozen in disbelief. The words hung in the air like a weight too heavy to bear. "My father?" Michael repeated, his voice barely audible. John nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "Yes, I was a different man back then, Michael. I made terrible choices that hurt your mother, and ultimately led to me abandoning you before you were even born. I was selfish, I was afraid, and I've regretted it every day since." Michael's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists as he tried to process the revelation. "You're telling me you're the man who left my mother to raise me on her own? You're the reason she had to work 3 jobs just to keep us afloat? You're the man who disappeared without a trace?" John's heart ached at the anger in Michael's voice, but he knew this moment was inevitable. "Yes," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was that man. And I'm so sorry, Michael. I can't begin to tell you how much I regret what I did." Michael stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with such force that it scraped against the floor. "Sorry?" he snapped. "You think sorry makes up for the fact that you abandoned us? Do you have any idea what my mother went through because of you? Do you even care?" John felt a lump rise in his throat. "I care," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've thought about you and your mother every day since I made that terrible decision. I know it's too late to change the past, but I'm here now. I'm here to tell you the truth, to try to make things right." Michael shook his head, pacing the room in frustration. "Make things right? How exactly do you plan on doing that? You come into my life after 30 years of silence, after all the pain and hardship you caused, and you think telling me the truth is enough? You think I'm just going to forgive you?" John's heart sank. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but hearing the anger and hurt in Michael's voice was more painful than he had anticipated. "I don't expect your forgiveness," John said softly. "I know I don't deserve it. But I'm dying, Michael. I have a rare blood disorder, and you're the only match for a bone marrow transplant. That's why I'm here. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to ask for your help. I don't deserve it, but you're my only chance." The room fell into a tense silence again, but this time the air felt colder, heavier. Michael stared at John, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "So, that's it?" he asked, his voice low and filled with bitterness. "You come here because you need something from me. After all this time, you need me to save your life?" John nodded, his throat tight. "Yes," he whispered, "but it's more than that. I came here to face the truth, to finally admit what I did. I know I'm asking for something I don't deserve, but I want to make things right in whatever time I have left. I want you to know that I'm sorry." Michael's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and sadness. "You want to make things right?" he said, his voice cracking. "You think saving your life will fix everything? I don't even know you. You're just a stranger to me. A man who hurt my mother and left us to fend for ourselves. And now you want me to be the one to save you?" John could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him, crushing him under the weight of his own mistakes. "I know I've failed you," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking, not as a father who abandoned you, but as a man who is trying for once in his life to do the right thing." The silence between them felt suffocating, heavy with unresolved emotions and years of pain that could never be undone. Michael stood there, staring at the man who had just turned his life upside down. The truth was out, and yet it offered no relief, no closure, only anger, confusion, and bitterness. John watched his son, heartbroken by the hurt he saw in Michael's eyes. He knew this would happen. He had known from the moment he decided to come clean that facing Michael wouldn't be easy. But he had underestimated just how deep the wounds ran. He had expected anger, but seeing the depth of betrayal on his son's face was more painful than anything he had imagined. "Why now?" Michael asked, his voice cold but laced with pain. "Why are you only telling me this now? You had 30 years to find me, to be a father, and now the only reason you're here is because you need something from me." John winced at the truth in Michael's words. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said, his voice cracking. "I wanted to come sooner, but I was a coward. I thought if I could just forget about what I did, everything would be fine. But it wasn't. I've spent years regretting what I did to you and your mother. I've spent years wishing I had made a different choice." "Regret doesn't change anything," Michael snapped, his hands clenching into fists. "You didn't just hurt my mother, you destroyed her. Do you know what it was like watching her struggle to make ends meet? To see her work herself to the bone while you lived in luxury, pretending we didn't exist?" John felt the full weight of Michael's words. He had thought up Grace often over the years, but hearing firsthand the impact his abandonment had on her was a knife to his heart. "I know I caused you both a lot of pain," John admitted, "and I can never take that back. But I'm here now because I want to make things right. I want to know you, Michael. I want to know the son I should have raised." Michael shook his head, the disbelief clear on his face. "You can't just show up and expect things to be okay," he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "You can't expect me to be the one to save you after everything you did. You're nothing to me, you're not my father, you're just a man who left us when we needed you the most." The words cut deep, but John knew he deserved them. He had no right to ask for anything from Michael, but there was no turning back now. His life depended on this man, the son he had abandoned. And yet, for the first time, it wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption. "I understand why you feel that way," John said softly, "and I don't blame you. But I'm not just asking for your help, I'm asking for a chance to make amends, to do something right for once in my life. I don't want to die without trying to fix the mistakes I made. I don't want to leave this world knowing I left you and your mother with nothing but pain." Michael's eyes flickered with mixture of emotions, anger, hurt, and something else. There was a part of him buried deep that wanted to believe John's words, that wanted to believe his father could somehow make things right. But the betrayal ran too deep, and forgiveness seemed impossible. "I can't forgive you," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after what you did to her, not after what you did to me. You think coming here and asking for my help will fix everything? It won't. Nothing will." John felt the weight of those words settle in his chest, but he didn't push. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael," he said, his voice steady. "I know that's something I haven't earned, but I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you that I'm not the man I used to be. I want to try, in whatever time I have left, to be a better person." Michael turned away, his back to John, trying to regain control of his emotions. He had spent his entire life wondering about the man who had abandoned him, wondering if his father ever thought about him, if he had ever regretted what he had done. Now the man was standing before him, asking for a chance to right his wrongs. But it was too late for that, wasn't it? "I don't owe you anything," Michael said, his voice shaky but resolute. "You left us, you made your choice, and now you expect me to help you just because you regret it?" John lowered his head, feeling the full weight of his failure as a father. "You're right," he said. "I don't deserve anything from you. But I'm asking anyway. I'm asking because you're my only chance. And if you don't want to help me, I'll understand. I won't force you, but I'll still be grateful that you listened to me, even if it was just for a moment." Michael stood there in silence, his heart torn. The logical part of him wanted to walk away, to leave John behind just as John had left him. But there was another part, the part that remembered his mother's teachings, her belief in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Grace had raised him to be a man who helped others, a man who didn't let anger or bitterness dictate his actions. For a long time, Michael remained silent, the room filled with the tension of his inner struggle. Finally, he turned to face John, his eyes filled with the sadness and anger of a lifetime. "If I agree to the transplant," Michael said slowly, "it won't be for you. It won't be because I want to save you or because I've forgiven you. It'll be because I'm a doctor and I save lives. That's what I do. But don't think for a second that this makes us even. This doesn't erase what you did to my mother or to me." John's heart leaped with hope, but he kept his emotions in check. He nodded, understanding the terms. "I don't expect this to make up for anything," he said softly. "But thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance." Michael didn't respond. He walked toward the door, his expression unreadable. Just before he left, he paused, turning back to look at John one last time. "After the transplant, we're done," Michael said firmly. "Don't come looking for me again. I don't need you in my life." John nodded, the ache in his chest growing deeper, but he understood. "I won't," he promised. "I won't come looking for you, but thank you." With that, Michael left the room, leaving John alone once again. The weight of everything that had been said hung in the air, and John felt a mixture of relief and deep sorrow. He had gotten what he came for, but the price was high. His son, the man he should have raised, should have loved, would never be a part of his life. John had lost that chance long ago. As John sat there alone with his thoughts, he realized that the transplant would save his life, but it wouldn't erase his past. The scars he had left on Grace and Michael would never heal completely, and he would have to live with that for the rest of his days. But at least, in this moment, he had faced the truth. He had told Michael everything, and though forgiveness might never come, John had taken the first step toward redemption. Whether it was enough, only time would tell. The days following his meeting with Michael felt like a blur to John. The tension, the weight of the past, and the fear of the future all hung heavy in the air. Despite everything, Michael had agreed to the transplant. John knew it wasn't out of love or forgiveness. Michael had made that clear. But the fact that his son was willing to save his life gave him hope. It was a small mercy, one John wasn't sure he deserved. But there was one more piece of the puzzle left unresolved. One more person John needed to face before he could attempt to move forward. Grace. As John sat in the sterile hospital room awaiting the start of his pre-transplant preparations, his thoughts kept returning to her. The woman he had betrayed, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise their son, alone and in silence. John had spent decades running from his guilt, but now, with time running short, he knew he couldn't leave without confronting the truth. He had to see Grace. After Michael had agreed to the transplant, John had instructed his private investigator to find Grace. She had never left the small town she had moved to after her departure from John's life, and now, 30 years later, she was living a quiet, content life. She hadn't remarried, but she had built a life of her own, filled with friends and community, a life where Michael had grown up surrounded by love and support. But John knew he had torn something from her that could never be fully repaired. Trust. He had taken her innocence, manipulated her with false promises, and left her to suffer the consequences of his cowardice. Facing her now, after all these years, was terrifying. The day of the meeting came faster than John had anticipated. His health had deteriorated further, and though the transplant was scheduled soon, he insisted on seeing Grace before the surgery. He couldn't go into the operating room without telling her the truth, without hearing her speak to him one last time. John arrived at Grace's house in the late afternoon, the sky painted with the soft hues of an impending sunset. As he stood at her door, he felt the same nervousness he had felt when meeting Michael. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about asking for something. This was about owning up to his past, to the pain he had caused. He wasn't here to ask for forgiveness. He was here to offer an apology, one that was decades overdue. The door opened, and there she was. Grace stood before him, older now, her face lined with years of experience and hardship, but still carrying the quiet strength John remembered so well. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back neatly, and her eyes, those same eyes that had once looked at John with such hope, now regarded him with calm indifference. "John," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I wasn't expecting you." John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "Grace, I didn't know how else to do this," he began, his voice shaky. "I know I don't deserve to be here, but I needed to see you. I needed to tell you the truth." Grace stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He entered her home, noticing how peaceful it felt compared to the chaos of his own life. The walls were adorned with family photos, most of them of Michael at different stages of his life. There was no trace of John here, no sign that he had ever been part of their story. And why would there be? Grace gestured for him to sit, and he did, his heart pounding in his chest. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands in her lap, waiting patiently for him to speak. "I've spent 30 years running from the truth," John said, his voice low. "I thought if I could just move on, if I could bury the past deep enough, I'd be fine. But I wasn't. I've been living with the weight of what I did to you, to Michael, every single day." Grace said nothing, her face impassive as she listened. "I lied to you," John continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "I made promises I never intended to keep. I used you, Grace. I took advantage of your kindness, your trust, and I destroyed everything we had. When you told me you were pregnant, I panicked. I framed you for something you didn't do because I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of my actions. I ruined your life, and I'm so sorry." Grace's expression remained calm, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She took a deep breath before speaking. "You think I didn't know that?" she said softly. "I knew, John. I knew you framed me. I knew you were lying. But what choice did I have? You had all the power. You were the one with the money, the influence. I was just a girl, naive enough to believe you when you said you cared about me." John felt a sharp pang of guilt pierce his heart. "I didn't deserve your trust," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that now, and I know that no apology will ever be enough." Grace looked down at her hands, her voice trembling slightly when she spoke again. "You don't know what it was like, John. Raising Michael on my own, watching him grow up without a father, I worked myself to the bone to give him a good life. And even then, it wasn't enough. He deserved so much more than I could give him. And all the while, I had to live with the knowledge that you were out there, living your life, never thinking about us." John closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of her words. He had always known he had hurt Grace, but hearing it from her, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it real in a way he had never understood before. "I'm sorry," John repeated, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I came here today because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you the truth. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know how deeply I regret what I did." Grace was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I've spent years trying to forget about you, John, trying to move on with my life. And I did. I built something good out of the wreckage you left behind. But I never stopped wondering what life could have been like if you had been the man I thought you were. If you had stayed." John's throat tightened. "I wish I had been that man," he said quietly. "But I wasn't. And I'll never forgive myself for that." Grace looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she admitted. "But I've spent too many years letting anger and bitterness control my life. I've raised a good son. I've built a life I'm proud of, and I'm tired, John. I'm tired of carrying the weight of what you did. So maybe one day I can let it go." John felt a flicker of hope, But he didn't push. He knew forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on her terms, in her own time. "I understand," he said softly. "Thank you for listening to me. That's more than I deserve." Grace stood, signaling that their conversation was over. "Take care of yourself, John," she said quietly, "and take care of Michael. He deserves to know the truth." John nodded, standing to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at Grace one last time. "I hope one day you can find peace," he said softly. Grace didn't respond, but her expression softened just slightly as she closed the door behind him. As John walked away, he felt the burden of his past still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in years, he felt something else too, the possibility of redemption. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and forgiveness might never come. But at least now, the truth was out, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start healing. If this emotional conclusion moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more powerful stories like this to come. So turn on notifications to stay updated on all our latest content. Your support means the world to us.